All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin our final speaker session of the afternoon. And to introduce our final speaker is the man who stood up on this stage last night to receive his justly deserved Emery Reeves Award, Mr. Rob Havers.
David, thank you very much, and a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the last session of today, one that will, I know, end the first day on a high. I'm sure you, as I, marvel at the continuing volume of books about Winston Churchill that emerge year after year. What more could there be to say now, even about Winston Churchill, we might ask? David Locke has managed not only to say new things, but to add great detail and provide a fascinating exposition of Churchill's finances, a topic, as you know, and as David demonstrates, that had its peaks and indeed its troughs, much like Churchill's own political career. David's book, No More Champagne, Churchill and His Money, is thorough and engaging and offers new Churchillian epithets to the canon. One of my favorites taken from his volume sees Churchill seeking new funds for yet another expenditure and lamenting, had I not been so foolish as to pay a lot of bills, I should have had that money available right now. David Locke is well qualified to write on this topic. A former member of the London Stock Exchange, a fellow of the Chartered Securities Institute, and with a career in private banking. Now, in semi-retirement, the world of finance's loss is most certainly the world of Churchill's gain. Ladies and gentlemen, David Locke.
Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you to the International Churchill Society, as I must now learn to call it again, for inviting me here this afternoon. There's been a lot of talk about this being the final session, so those of you who have come to it, thank you very much. And I thought we should keep it quite light, it being the final session. You've been here a long time today already. Fortunately, this is a subject which I think has to be taken quite lightly. Although I guess Churchill never took it that lightly himself. You know, he said he hated money was the only thing that worried him in life. He hated business affairs. And if you read Speaking for Themselves, Mary Solmes's collection of his letters to Clementine, money is a worry throughout his life, almost up to the end, when probably it didn't need to be, but it was. But it was never quite so bad as my title, No More Champagne, might imply. It is, of course, a publisher's title. And I want to reassure you, I don't think there ever was no more champagne, literally, in Churchill's life. Though it did in March 1938, when his financial affairs were about to implode, he was reduced to saying, no more champagne is to be served to guests. But he reserved for himself 1 imperial pint a day. And I don't know whether you voted for Brexit, sir. You're applauding, but one of the first things that has happened since our rather surprising Brexit vote is that Paul Roger have announced that they are going to bring back the imperial pint bottle of champagne. Now, to business, as Churchill would reluctantly say. David Freeman gave me this title, Churchill's Financial Team, and I suppose as an Englishman, I'm always thinking of teams in units of 11, because these games that we pretend as Englishmen to have invented and given the world, like cricket and hockey and soccer, we always work in units of 11. But somehow I thought 11 was not a sufficiently Churchillian size of team. And so I thought maybe I should look more at American football as an example. because when I watch it on my visits over here, I'm always amazed by the number of players on the sidelines waiting to come in, coming out in. And then when I did a little tiny bit of research for this, I found that, in fact, American football teams work in units of 11. I mean, did you know, is that right? But you very helpfully have a sort of offense and a defense, and I believe even a specialist kickers team. Are they 11 as well? Or? So it's 33. Is that right? Is it 33 people in total? 53, I'm here. Well, look, I don't have time for 53, but I thought what I would do is sort of borrow more from American football than soccer, which we call football. And I particularly liked the four quarters. And I'm going to take the four quarters, and I'm going to highlight a few players in each quarter. And I'm also going to give you, and this is American football, I'm going to give you a bit of halftime entertainment. So first quarter. And now this is a defensive lineup, let me tell you. It won't have escaped your attention that all the players that I'm highlighting in this quarter, which roughly goes from birth, 1874, up to 1900, 25 years odd, they're all women, okay? Because it was to women that Churchill looked for support in the first, while he was a student, for financial support. He had to, because he was being kept on a very tight leash by his father at the time, partly because his father had very little money till the final years, partly because his father thought he was hopeless with money. His son was hopeless with money. So his father's always keeping him very tight, won't even give him an allowance at Sandhurst. But he appeals to the women in his letters for help, and they nearly always pay up. First, on your left is his nanny, Mrs. Everest, from whom he was a reasonably frequent borrower, and she complained that he didn't always acknowledge the loans in writing and was often late repaying them. And on your right is his father's sister, Aunt Cornelia, Lady Wimborne. Now, Aunt Cornelia had the good sense to marry money. She married into the Guest family, which in British terms is a great iron and steel family. They had lots of money, and Aunt Cornelia was very reliable. If young Winston wrote her a letter, she would write back, and she would always enclose a nice sum of money with that letter. And in fact, she went on, later in life to give him money for his parliamentary expenses, and then famously in 1921, when he bought a Rolls Royce, and it didn't really meet expectations, she bought it back. She took it off him 3 months after he bought it. Had only a 10% discount to the list price. Now, I could have added others. I could have added the woman who signed herself, your deputy mother, Lady Wilson, who always enclosed £2. I mean, that's sort of $300 today with every letter she wrote him. I could have included Aunts Clara and Leonie, probably not the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough, who tended to take her son, Lord Randolph's side, and administer stern lectures to Winston. But pride of place, I think, in this quarter has to go to the woman in the middle, Jenny Jerome, about whom we've been hearing earlier, and I endorse everything that was said earlier. She is a star. She's not necessarily a financial role model, it has to be said. Rather the reverse. She's highly extravagant, has no real sense of money. She has a sense of entitlement to the best. But, in the early days when Lord Randolph was still alive, she felt she had to give her son, Winston, a bit of a scolding when he asked for money, but then she normally came up with the goods. But she became really important after her husband's death. He left his two sons no formal allowance. He left his money in trust for his wife. She didn't really understand what a trust was and the difference between income and capital. But she did allow Winston £500, today's equivalent of about $60,000, $70,000 a year allowance. And she used to, for the first couple of years after her husband died, she regularly coached him that he had to live within his means. All the while, she was spending the capital from the trust. And eventually, the lawyers rumbled to this, and she had to write to Winston out in India and say, I'm terribly sorry, please sign here, and we'll regularize this. And from then on, her lectures about sticking within his means dried up. She didn't lecture him anymore, and they shared their money problems. But he reacted to these financial problems by going out and, as we've heard, doubling up as a journalist, writing from Afghanistan, Sudan, as well as a soldier. I've closed it too much. She acted as his agent back at home. She sold his articles, sold his first books, and boomed his, as she called it, did a great PR campaign for his first efforts. So she was absolutely vital to his early steps. And it was only later that the tide turned when she got into trouble with her second marriage, and she became dependent on him. And he and Jack had spent a lot of time sorting out her affairs, particularly over her second marriage, and then at her death, when she died not only intestate without a will, but owing lots of money to lots of people. So it was it was a bit of a mixture. Now, I want to check that the second slide is coming up. It's not. No. Can anybody help me at the back? It's up on my screen here, but it's not up on your screen. Okay, when we get it up, in the middle is going to be that next one. In the middle, no, back one. That's the one. That's the one. Don't close it too much. Right. There we go. Okay. In the middle is the man who looked after in today's money, about $1.25 million that Churchill had saved by 1900, by the end of his lecture tours after the Boer War. You heard about his Boer War escape, made him an international star. He not only wrote books, but he lectured in the UK and over here. And at the end of that tour, he'd made something like $1.25 million. And he needed it looked after. Enter this guy in the middle here, Sir Ernest Cassel, an immigrant from Europe. He'd come over in about 1870. He'd started as a cotton trader in Liverpool. He quickly moved to London as a banker. And he over the course of about 20 years, he supplanted the Rothschilds, in fact, in leadership in the City of London. And he looked after, and I use the word in sort of quotation marks, he looked after the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, and his coterie. He looked after their financial affairs. And he lived in Grosvenor Square, where his next-door neighbor was the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough. And so he became friends with Winston Churchill's parents, And he had a soft spot for young Winston, particularly after his father's death. And he offered to manage Winston's savings for nothing. And Winston thought he did it very well. And then he invited Winston out to the opening of the Aswan Dam, which he had financed in Egypt. He invited him to holidays in his Swiss chalet. And when I say Swiss chalet, don't think of some modest little thing. It was huge. He equipped the Bolton Street Library for Churchill. He gave him £500, so we're talking sort of $75,000 on in cash on his wedding. And when Winston Churchill went to fight in the front in 1915 and went on the fairly miserly army major's pay originally and was worried about the finances at home, Sir Ernest Cassel said to him, "Don't worry, I give you unlimited credit." And his final service financial service to Winston Churchill was in 1920, when Churchill overextended himself, found himself the contractual buyer of 2 homes in London when he only meant to buy 1. And he tried to pull out of his sale to the Duke of Wellington's son. He expected to be able to get out of it, but actually the Duke of Wellington's son said, "Hey, we have a contract, and I will blacken your name if you try to worm out of it." And he had to go off to Ernest Cassel because he was fully borrowed by the time, and Cassel wrote out a check and covered it, and conveniently died 2 months later, and his executors never asked for the money back. Now, as he spent his savings in the first decade of the 20th century, his bankers became more important because they had to lend to him. His bankers were Cox & Co., who generally banked the British Army officers. And actually, Churchill never changed his bank in the whole of his life. The bank changed a bit because Cox & Co. was taken over by Lloyd's Bank. He gave them a fair number of nightmares, and his bank managers had some pretty worried evenings and nights, I suspect, but Lloyd's never lost a single pound in lending to him in the end. And his relationship manager, as we would call them today, for the first 20 years or so, I couldn't find a picture of him, which is a shame. W.H. Bernau, Walter, I think it is, but he always signed himself W.H. And he was Churchill's relationship manager for 20 years. And we know quite a bit about the relationship because he donated, or his son donated, all his papers, both official and the notes he took at their meetings, to Churchill, and it became part of the deposit into the Churchill Archive Centre. And for a sort of boring banker, would-be historian like me, they're a dream, these papers. And they're there, you can see them. They're Series 28 papers in the Churchill Archive Centre. He took careful notes. He was a fellow Mason, gave him a certain affinity with Winston, and he was endlessly patient. And he always had faith in Churchill as a customer. So whenever he missed loan repayment deadlines or failed to bring his overdraft back, under the promised limit, Bernau tried to make sure that within the bank's hierarchy, he was given another chance. And on the few dates that he wasn't, Bernau would always try and sort him out with insurance companies instead, because Bernau was an insurance specialist. Now, the lady on the right, I'm so glad you've got your picture, because I would have found it difficult to convey the full pomp of this lady on your right. Does anybody know who she is? She is Frances, Marchioness of Londonderry, who's, by her 1862 will, left her own property in Ireland, not her husband's, her own property in Ireland, which was called the Garran Tower Estate. And like many women of aristocratic husbands, she wasn't interested in leaving it to their eldest son, because the eldest son was always going to be, and the children of the eldest son were always going to be looked after by the husband. And mothers worried about the younger children. So she left the Garran Tower estate to the children of her younger children. Okay? She had, by the time, she knew she had 3 grandsons at least, and she had, there were going to be sons from her daughter, who married the 7th Duke of Marlborough. And there, I suppose, is the clue. But it was to go, the estate had to stay together, so it was to go in order of male seniority. Now, the amazing thing is that the 3 grandsons each died childless. And the last of them died in a train crash in 1921 on a strip of rail, a single track of rail in North Wales. 2 trains collided, and on them was the last of her grandsons. He was a director of the railway company, so don't feel too sorry for him. And so it was an extremely remote chance that this happened, but the estate fell to the children of her daughter. And of course, that would have been the oldest, the second son, because the first was looked after again. It would have gone to Lord Randolph Churchill if he'd been alive, but he had by then died. So it fell into the hot, sticky hands of Winston Churchill. And after death duties in Ireland, it was still worth today's equivalent of about $5 million. And very welcome it was, too. I remember that Clementine said the day after this accident, she wrote to Winston, her husband, and said, "I cannot describe the blessed feeling of relief that we need never, never be worried about money again." And then she said in brackets, "except through our own fault, of course." And you know, this is what happens. The spending goes up. That's when they buy the Rolls Royce. She takes a lady's maid full-time, travels with her. His stock trading goes up. And I say trading, it's not investment. And the gambling goes up. Big losses in 1923. And so Chartwell, too, you know, that was 3 times budget it ran to in the end. And actually, by 1925, when Winston becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer, most of the inheritance is gone 4 years later. And this is where we have a little pause while he's Chancellor of the Exchequer, because he has to behave pretty well. But I thought this is my halftime entertainment with a surprising entertainer. Now, the clue, for those of you who may be wondering why on earth, I thought I'd call it skating on thin ice. This is the name of the entertainment, your halftime entertainment, skating on thin ice. And the clue is in the picture. That building is called Somerset House. And it was, no longer is, but it was the headquarters of Her Majesty's Inland Revenue, which is our equivalent of the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. And so my halftime entertainer is, in fact, no less than the chairman of the Inland Revenue. Because when Winston became Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is our Secretary of the Treasury, in 1925, responsible for tax policy and tax collection, and he thought, first of all, as Chancellor, I'd better sell up all my shares, I'd better pay down my debts, there should be a surplus, I think there's going to be a surplus, and I'm going to just, behave financially very responsibly while I'm Chancellor. Unfortunately, when he sold all the shares, there was not a surplus. He was left with a deficit. He had as much as the bank. He had an overdraft with the maximum size the revenue would, the bank would allow him to have. And he had about today's equivalent of $500,000 of tax still to pay. And he was the Chancellor, but he had no money to pay it with. So what he did was summon the chairman of the Inland Revenue and say, Houston, we got a problem, in as many words. And what, have you got any suggestions? And the chairman of the Inland Revenue is not a sort of experienced civil servant near the end of his career who can say to him, Chancellor, I think this conversation better stop here and now. He's a 37-year-old high flyer with his career ahead of him. So he says, Chancellor, I understand the problem. Let me talk to my senior people and see what we can do. And a week later, he comes back on an unofficial, his own note paper in his own hand and says, we found an anomaly. If you retire as an author, your author's earnings that are as yet unpaid or as yet untaxed, we will be able to you've retired, so there clearly can't be income, they're capital receipts, and capital receipts are untaxed. And this should halve your tax bill. And Churchill says, thank you very much, sounds fine. And he writes the necessary letter, and his tax bill is halved. So that's all fine, except by the following year, 1926, he's still Chancellor. He's paid quite well as Chancellor, but it's not enough. The bills from Chartwell are still coming in. He realizes he's got to start writing again. And he gets the Prime Minister's permission to write the next volume of The World Crisis. And suddenly he thinks, oh, I wonder if there's a problem. If I start writing again now, I only retired a year ago, maybe they'll deem my retirement never to have taken place, and I'll have to pay that tax I have to say, which I can't afford to do. So he summons the chairman of the Inland Revenue again and says, you remember you helped me to retire a year ago? I now need you to help me unretire. And you got it. The guy says, I'll talk to my senior people. And he comes back a week later. He says, if you write me a letter like this, it should be okay. And Churchill writes the letter, and it was okay. That's my halftime entertainment for you. Now, third quarter. This is a bit busier this quarter. More people on the field, but Churchill's very much in charge. He did it his way. And top left is Bernard Baruch, one of your own. They'd become friends in the late stages of the First World War, when Churchill was responsible for munitions, and Bernie Baruch is the chairman of the War Supplies Board. And they learned to trust each other. And the relationship was cemented really in 1929, when Churchill lost his job as Chancellor of the Exchequer. The government was turned out. And he decided to take a long tour to the US, and he asked Bernie Baruch to arrange for his hosts over here, which he did, big men, Schwab, Hearst, people like that. And then when he got to New York, Bernie Baruch acted as his host, paid his hotel bills. And he gave him a desk. I mean, Churchill had by now got really absorbed into the bull market in shares that was going on in August, September 1929. He got really sucked in. And Bernie Baruch was one of the big players in Wall Street, gave him a desk next to his own, introduced him to his brokers, and off they went. In the last stages of that bull market, Churchill was dealing in his turnover, I worked out, in today's money terms, was sort of about $1 million a day. In and out of stocks, very, quick, range trading, really. When the crash hit, he was down $1 million. Now, legend has it, Jock Colville put this out, really, that Bernard Baruch saw him repaid the whole of his losses. I could find no evidence for that at all. I could find that he transferred the profits on 2 personal trades to Churchill, worth about $100,000 in today's money. So, you know, I think Churchill's losses would have been 1.1, but because Bernie transferred 2 trades to him, they were contained to $1 million. And thereafter, you know, I mean, Bernard Baruch, I mean, there was no general rescue, and in fact, his advice to Churchill in the immediate aftermath of the crash was not great. He said, storm over, you know, I'm getting back involved. And Churchill got back involved, and he lost half as much again in 1930. Money that he certainly didn't have. Later on in the 1930s, Bernie Baruch's advice was better, or market advice. It wasn't always followed by Churchill, who kept hoping that he could recover his position. But he was an important financial friend. Bottom left, I've got brother Jack Churchill, and you know, Jack was a partner in Winston's London brokers, Vickers da Costa. And in the first heady days of Winston Churchill's inheritance in 1921, when he was off in France, he gave Jack discretion, a lot of discretion over the dealings in stocks. But in the 1930s, when he was trying to recover his debts, he didn't give Jack discretion. In fact, he dealt more with Cecil Vickers, the senior partner of Vickers da Costa. And he gave him orders. He listened occasionally to Cecil Vickers' views on the market, but generally he took his own decisions. And all Jack had to do was bail him out a couple of times because he owed the brokerage a lot of money, and Jack was a partner, and the rest of the partners looked to Jack to make good Winston Churchill's debts on a couple of occasions when they got a bit out of control. But Winston did repay his brother. Now, on the right-hand side, I've got a figure you may or may not recognize, Alexander Korda, because I think he's an important financial friend. Hungarian-born, Hollywood filmmaker, successful Hollywood filmmaker in the late 1920s, and introduced to Churchill by Randolph in 1934, when he had come over to Europe determined to rebreed Europe's film industry on the Hollywood model. And he was well funded by the Prudential Insurance Company, and he saw the scope for having Winston Churchill involved, and he paid Churchill very handsomely in 1934 and 1935 as a screenwriter for a couple of films. They were never made. One of them was actually about the King's Jubilee, we were hearing this morning, about his later admiration for George V, and one was a film in adulation of George V for his Silver Jubilee. They had rather similarly extravagant tastes, Korda and Churchill. They got on well, although Korda was 20 years younger. But after these two payments in 1934 and 1935, Korda vanishes for the moment, but keep him in your mind because he will reappear. And despite these payments, Churchill's debts in the 1930s just grew and grew. If you've read my book, you will see, I mean, they grew to the modern day equivalent of $3 or $4 million. Financing charges alone were costing him today's equivalent of about $250,000 a year. And eventually the implosion that I spoke about right at the beginning occurred in March 1938, on literally the day that Hitler ordered his troops into Vienna for the so-called Anschluss. And this is where the pair in the middle come in, and they are perhaps the most important pair of any faces that I will show you today. On the top is Brendan Bracken. A bit confusing, there are two, Bernie Baruch, Brendan Bracken. This is Brendan Bracken, Irishman, mysterious, attached himself to Churchill in 1923 as a young fixer, really, bag carrier stroke fixer. Then when Churchill became Chancellor, went off to pursue his own publishing career at Eyre and Spottiswoode, and amazingly, in his 20s still, put together a publishing empire that is still there today. Magazines called, The Banker, The General Practitioner, the Financial News that became the major part of the Financial Times, and he bought 50% of The Economist magazine for Eyre and Spottiswoode. Now, the other 50% was owned by a syndicate led by the man below him, Henry Strakosch, a name with which every Churchillian should be intimately familiar. And yet, when I talk in Britain, nobody really knows who Strakosch is. But he's the guy who rescued Churchill financially in every way. He rescued him from bankruptcy in 1938. He allowed him to continue as a politician. Because what happened is this, that when Churchill's finances imploded in March 1938, Churchill handed his stockbroking papers to Brendan and said something like, I mean, this isn't recorded, so I'm surmising, Brendan, unless you can help me, I may be finished, because you can't carry on as an MP if you're bankrupt. And Brendan Bracken took the papers round to Strakosch. He chose carefully. He knew Strakosch through The Economist. He knew him also because Strakosch was a currency economist. He'd done work for the Reserve Bank of South Africa. And while he was in South Africa, he was asked to chair a company called Union Corporation, which was a mining company. And Union Corporation mined precious metals that were used in the armaments industries. And they exported to both Germany and to Britain. And Strakosch knew the sales figures for both countries in the late 1930s. And he could see the fantastic climb on what was going into Germany and much flatter figures going into Britain. And he was one of Churchill's informants for Churchill's speeches to the House of Commons in the late 1930s about the extent of German rearmament. And he thought Churchill was the only politician really standing up to what was going on in Germany. And he thought he had to be kept in the game. And apart from that, he was unmarried. He had no family. He was a wealthy man. And when Brendan Bracken came and said, Winston's in trouble, he needs, well, in dollars today, it was more than $1 million right now. He took out his pen and he signed a check for the entire amount, and he didn't ask for anything in return. Now, do you know what I mean, that much was known. You will find it more or less in the official biography. What isn't in the official biography, and what I found, one of my most startling finds as far as I was concerned, that the same sort of thing happened in June 1940. Within weeks of Churchill becoming prime minister and leading the struggle, he found he could not pay his bank interest bills, his tax at the end of June 1940. And he had a special statement of his bank account drawn up. He gave it to Brendan Bracken. Brendan Bracken took it to Strakosch, and Strakosch wrote a second check to keep Churchill in the game. It was the equivalent of about $300,000. Not a fact that's known, but these two literally kept Churchill in the game. And I said I hadn't quite finished with Corder because Corder comes back in the war. He comes over to Hollywood again at the beginning of the war. People thought it was a strange move. Why would he leave London, come over to Hollywood? Well, it seems that he was sent, it was part of a British intelligence effort to nudge Americans towards the war, make films that will help the war effort, that Hamilton Woman. But he also worked on the US studios, and he made a series of offers, some of them with American film studios, Warner and MGM, for Churchill's old book rights. And during the war and immediately after it, Corder paid Churchill, Corder or his companies paid Churchill, today's equivalent, I worked out, about $7.5 million. And one other film guy beat Corder to one of the film rights and paid $2.5 million for those. So $10 million in today's money went into Churchill's accounts during the war. He started the war in serious debt. He finished it with $5 million in his current account and a new London home that's just gone on the market for $30 million. Obviously, it didn't cost him the then equivalent of $30 million. But Corder is a very important player. Now, fourth quarter, final quarter. Top left, another unfamiliar face, I think. I don't know if anybody can pick him, but this is a much underrated guy because he was understated. This is Bill Berry, better known as Lord Camrose, who put together an amazing stable of newspapers in his working life, split it with his brother. By wartime, his main newspaper is the Daily Telegraph. And he is absolutely central financial friend to Churchill from 1944 till Camrose's death in 1954. He played an important part in sorting out the mess that Churchill got himself into during the war, when three different sets of publishers thought they had the rights to his post-war memoirs, and there was a muddle-up over the film rights to History of the English-Speaking Peoples. And Camrose and the lawyer, Charles Nicholl, very sort of gently eased him out of that problem. 1945-6, it was Camrose who led the syndicate, put together the syndicate. It was his idea, and he put together the syndicate that bought Chartwell off Churchill, gave it to the National Trust, allowed the Churchills to stay in situ, gave them £50,000 for a house which had failed to sell for $20,000 just before the war. And it was he who led the sales of the Second World War memoirs, the rights package here in New York, very quietly in October 1946. And who negotiated the detail with the Time Life and the New York Times. And it was he who, again in 1953, when Churchill had his stroke, provided some interest-free loans for liquidity purposes, and who kept the press, persuaded the British press, to keep the stroke quiet. So signal services were provided by Camrose. And his other partner in delivering this sort of post-war financial emancipation of Churchill was Anthony Moore, his solicitor. He started as a tax lawyer. He came in 1942 when Churchill wanted to take on the Inland Revenue about the way his non-ministerial earnings were taxed during the war. And they did take the Inland Revenue to a tribunal privately. It was another very surprising story, which actually Randolph first put me onto. Thank you, Randolph, because the solicitors involved, where Anthony Moore came from, Fladgate, still have a lovely memo of Moore's first meeting with Churchill. It's almost worth reading the book just for that memo, actually, which all 75 partners of Fladgate's, I think, had to approve for copyright reasons to be in the book. But it's a lovely memo. Very vivid. And Anthony Moore, I mean, he worked his way. Churchill retained him after the war because he wanted a tax structure for writing the memoirs, which Moore delivered together with a barrister called Charles Graham Dixon. And he became a very Churchill trusted him completely. He was very methodical, he was very calm, he was very thorough, his advice was good, and Churchill came to trust him over the whole range of his affairs. And really, he didn't do anything post-war that hadn't been under Anthony Moore's nose first. In the middle, a financial friend who you should be familiar with. If you don't recognize him immediately, the clue is in the two magazines behind, Life and Fortune. It is Henry Luce. His main post-war paymaster. Immediately after the war, while Churchill was still technically retired as an author, he couldn't write articles, so Life bought a story based on his pictures, reproductions of his pictures. And then the secret speeches made to the House of Commons during the war. And then Time was the main buyer of the US rights to the Second World War memoirs. And it was Henry Luce who sort of put together the consortium with the New York Times to achieve that. It was Luce who approved the payment for Churchill's holidays. Somewhat grudgingly, he said, paying statesmen's holidays is beyond me, but if you think we got to do it, we got to do it, or words to that effect. And he let Dan Longwell, his life chairman, get on with it. He was a great delegator, I decided. Top right, Emery Reeves. Now, Emery Reeves was very important in Churchill's pre-war newspaper sales. He took his columns worldwide. It was more important, I think, for Churchill's morale and for his political reach than just financial terms, which, it was good to have them, but it wasn't a game changer. And actually, he played very much second role to Camrose in the negotiation of the New York sales of the war memoirs, very much second. They were a pair, but he was second. Rather contrary to the account he gave to Martin Gilbert, and that is in the official biography. I mean, I'm afraid there's no doubt about it. He oversold his role to Martin Gilbert big time. But he did get a cut into the US book and foreign rights, and he gave good advice on the text of the war memoirs, and he made a huge amount of money out of the war memoirs, particularly the foreign rights. He had a lovely house in the south of France on the back of it. He built up a collection of Impressionist paintings, and he gave the Monet to Churchill, which is present in Chartwell. And finally, is bottom right, Anthony Montague Brown, who, when he was first seconded to be Churchill's private secretary after Churchill left office, was warned by Harold Macmillan, the then foreign secretary, who was seconding him from the Foreign Office. He said, "Whatever you do, Mr. Montague Brown, whatever you do, don't get sucked into Mr. Churchill's financial affairs." But of course, he found that such was the scale of spending that he had to get involved. They had to create new revenue streams. They had to be ones which wouldn't get taxed, so they had to be sales of rights. And so he had to learn about the film industry and the recording industry, and gradually he did. He was a diplomat. He was a very good networker. He built good contacts over time. And after a slow start, by the end, he was getting good money in. And he also performed the signal service of holding off the Inland Revenue Service, the IRS, until after Churchill's death. So his executors had to deal with him. And Churchill would not have the distress of having to pay lots of back American taxes. Finally, a little bit of post-match analysis. I just thought, I think it's wonderful. If those of you who have been to Britain in the last month may know that Churchill now graces the back of our newest banknote, the £5 plastic banknote. This man who was a great expert in debt and derivatives and risk-taking and rescues and failed austerity regimes now graces the back of the Bank of England's. I just think he would be profoundly unhappy with the denomination chosen for him. £5 is our cheapest, is our lowest denomination banknote. And £5 today, I look back at my things, £5 today, pre-World War I, was worth 1 shilling. 1 shilling. And what did 1 shilling buy pre-First World War? Well, it didn't even buy a half bottle of Paul Roger. That cost 3 shillings and 9pence. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, so we've got about 5, 6, 7 minutes, something like that, before we have to make bus announcements. So, sir, do you want to just wait for a microphone? Otherwise, I'll have to repeat your question.
I was wondering what Churchill's reputation was on the street in political circles, and how anybody would have put him in as Chancellor of the Exchequer, given his apparent expertise in financial matters.
What was his reputation on the street? Well, I think actually at the time that he was Chancellor, not very much was known about his private finances. He didn't let on about his inheritance. He told Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, that he'd been able to buy Chartwell with his earnings from the book, The World Crisis. You know, I mean, after the Second World War, his literary sales were enormous. Before that, they weren't huge, and he didn't make huge amounts of money from his books. And Chartwell was bought with the inheritance rather than with the book earnings. But I think people thought, you know, he's a successful writer. He's probably got some money. In the 30s, things changed a bit. I mean, I think the circle of knowledge became a bit wider about his financial problems. He was so late paying a lot of bills, and he kept his rescue by Strakosch. The knowledge of that was very, very tight. He didn't even tell his lawyers. He didn't tell his bankers. The money went straight to the stockbrokers. The only people I think knew were his brother Jack, and obviously Brendan Bracken and Strakosch. But I mean, part of, I think David Cannadine said, you know, in May 1940, there were a lot of people who were almost as worried about about Churchill becoming Prime Minister. I've given myself away, as Trump becoming president. Because, you know, he did have a reputation for being an adventurer, and you know, he was regarded as not 100% trustworthy. I'm talking about May 1940. You know, there was a bit of knowledge that his affairs were a bit rickety.
I was saying that it's my understanding that Clementine Churchill found herself quite aggravated and concerned about their cash flow and the debt that they were going into, particularly centered around Chartwell. Can you comment on the distress that this caused Clementine Churchill?
Yes, I mean, I think you're undoubtedly right. She hated, as I read that little excerpt about when the inheritance came their way and the feeling of relief. You know, she said it's like floating in a bath of cream. She was so relieved because she hated not being able to pay their bills. And she did think, I mean, the reason she didn't like the idea of Chartwell, which she wasn't told about until it had happened, was that she thought it would prove to be a millstone around their neck. And you know, I suppose in purely financial terms it was, that the staff needed for the upkeep was very, very expensive. But I did find, you know, most of the time the household accounts are not in the archives because Clementine was in charge of paying them. And she needed a whole lot more money to do so than the monthly allowance. There's only 2 years, 1935 and 1936, when the household accounts are merged with Churchill's accounts, because that's when they were trying to make, you know, that's when they were getting really worried about the money, and they brought in accountants to try and sort it out and reduce expenditure. And so the accountants had the sort of overview of everything. And for those 2 years, we find all the household accounts in there. And I can only say that I was astonished by the scale of Clementine's spending. You know, I thought she was always a sort of restraint and very modest taste and this and that. You know, that I think is how we've all received it. But, you know, I put in the book that I can't remember whether it was 1935 or 1936, her bill at Harrods, and she had bills with about a dozen department stores, but her bill at Harrods alone ran to 80 pages. And there were times when she did seem to, you know, her husband would announce one of his economy regimes, and she would seem to go out and sort of buy some big-ticket items immediately afterwards. So it's a little more complex, I think, than the traditional picture. But you're undoubtedly right. She found it very stressful, and she hated it, but she still spent.
Thank you, David. Well, we've had a pretty spectacular day so far, and we've got a very special evening ahead. And none of this happens without the work of a large and very dedicated team of people. So I'm going to take the opportunity to thank them all right now, beginning with, of course, with our chairman, Mr. Lawrence Geller, who got the ball rolling when he chose the site for this year. Rounded up a wonderful team of sponsors to help fund the costs of this, and these spectacular sponsors are listed in your brochure and in the signage out in the hallway. Randolph Churchill, our newly installed president, the first president of the International Churchill Society. Lee Pollock, our outgoing executive director, amazing amount of work, ably assisted by his beautiful wife, Jill, who has taught me an enormous amount about how to run these things. Dan Myers, our treasurer, could not be here, but he handled the financial side. John David Olson, the very tall gentleman there, is our webmaster, handled the website, registration, emails. Justin Reish, who one of his jobs is my associate editor as Finest Hour. I have to tell you, the next issue of Finest Hour will be delayed 1 month because we've spent the last month doing nothing but organizing this conference. And somewhere in the middle of that, and Justin, I have to tell you, is the man who is the glue that holds this all together in putting these conferences together. It's not his first time. But somewhere in the middle of this year's organization, he found time to get married and go on to honeymoon to Spain. Amazing. We can never do a conference without having somebody on the ground in the city where it's going to be done. For that, we have Sonia Renberg to thank. But she's a double act. Her mother, Linda, has been helping us out, particularly today in the bookstore. Megan Frost did the graphics for our brochure and for all the signage that you see. And finally, we have two newly minted MAs in history, Mr. Art Tell and Mr. Christopher Welch-Lebreau, whom you've all met there, manning our registration desk. All right. Thank you to all of them. All right, from 4 to 5, we will have the book signing, so all of the authors who are present and have books available should be in the Chinese room. Most of the people speaking today or tomorrow do have books in there. We have some books for people who are not speaking. I'd particularly note Edwina Sands has a beautiful book about her grandfather's paintings. And finally, of course, most important, how we are getting to the State Department this evening. Okay, the buses will be leaving from the DeSalis Street side of the hotel, which is that side of the hotel. We'll begin boarding at approximately 5:45. The buses will be staggered in their departure, so as they fill, they'll leave, and we will make sure everyone gets there. Now, remember to bring the identification with you that you used when you registered for the State Department security. So if you are not a U.S. citizen, that would be your passport. If you are a U.S. citizen, you either used your passport or your driver's license. If you can't remember which one you used, bring them both. Don't take a chance. Bring your ID. With that, I will see you later on this evening. Thank you.